The high chamber of Ethelgard smelled of sterile air and the faint metallic tong of the Krell's humidified breathing. Ambassador Alara Vance stood on the obsidian dais, her hands steady despite the holographic feed showing the execution of the Vanguard 9 captives. The Krell High Overseer leaned forward, his mandibles clicking in a rhythmic, mocking sequence that translated as laughter. He called it a demonstration of biological superiority. He called the humans fragile. Ilara didn't scream, she didn't weep. She simply looked into the Overseer's multifaceted eyes and spoke into the silence of the hegemony. "You mistook a leash for a lack of teeth," she said, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper that carried further than any shout. The transition from the golden spires of Ethelgard to the cold, vibrating deck of the UN Sovereign happened in the space of a single heartbeat. 3 years of diplomatic stagnation, of bowing and scraping to predatory empires, ended with a thumbprint on a glass screen. For decades, Earth had curated an image of the soft-bodied scholar, the cautious merchant, and the tireless peacekeeper. They had signed the Geneva Stellar Accords. They had limited their kinetic yields and mothballed their AI swarms. It was a performance. It was a gift they gave the galaxy, so they wouldn't have to become what they were in the dark. Alar remembered the day the Krell first arrived. They were beautiful, in a terrible way, all chitin and predatory grace. They saw the humans' refusal to glass rebellious colonies as a defect. They saw the medical aid ships as prey. Ilara had tried to explain the concept of restraint during a private summit on the moon of Xylos. She had sat across from General Vrax, watching him tear into a piece of raw meat, and told him that humanity wasn't playing by the rules. They were holding the monsters in the cage. Vrax had just sharpened his claws on the table and told her that cages were for the weak. Now, the cage was open. Deep in the Onyx Reach, far from the prying sensors of the hegemony's civilized patrols, the Sovereign began to hum. It wasn't the rhythmic thrum of a standard warp drive. It was a high-pitched, bone-shaking whine of relativistic rails charging to capacities that shouldn't exist. Behind the ship, 10,000 ghost slugs, solid tungsten rods no larger than a human arm, began to glow with blue Cherenkov radiation. There was no fire, no dramatic countdown, just a series of muffled duds that vibrated through the soles of Alara's boots as she watched the tactical display. The Krell fleet was a prideful assembly of jagged spires and heavy shielding, currently orbiting the ruins of Vanguard 9. They were celebrating a victory over a peaceful outpost. They didn't see the slugs. You couldn't see something moving at 98% of the speed of light until it had already passed through your hull, your reactor, and the space-time coordinates of your immediate future. The first Krell dreadnought didn't explode. It simply ceased to be a cohesive object. One moment, it was a mountain of black iron. The next, it was a cloud of expanding plasma and shrapnel. In fact, the kinetic energy was so immense that the impact turned the ship's internal atmosphere into a momentary star. Alara watched the sensor ghost of Vrax's flagship. She thought about the letters she'd have to write to the families of the Vanguard 9 crew. She thought about how the galaxy was about to learn that civilized war is a sport. Total war is an extinction event. The Onyx Reach transformed into a graveyard of light. The Krell fleet, designed for the slow, grinding broadsides of orbital dominance, had no answer for physics accelerated to the breaking point. On the bridge of the Sovereign, the silence was absolute, save for the wet, rhythmic click of a cooling vent. Alara watched the tactical holomap as the predatory red icons of the hegemony blinked out like dying embers in a storm. It turned out that the Krell had never seen a nanite swarm in high-velocity deployment. They called them gray ghosts, but the reality was a shimmering, microscopic fog that didn't just break hulls, it unmade them. The AI-driven clouds drifted through the debris of the dreadnoughts, stripping the heavy isotopes from the Krell reactors to fuel their own replication. They didn't just kill, they recycled the enemy into more of themselves. A single communication burst broke through the static. It was General Vrax, his voice distorted by the gravitational interference of his collapsing ship. He wasn't laughing anymore. There was a sound in his breathing that resembled a human choke. He demanded to know why the humans had hidden this, why they had allowed the Krell to believe they were helpless. Ilara leaned toward the pickup, her face reflected in the dark glass of the view screen. "We didn't hide it to trick you, Vrax," she said, watching a nanite cloud dissolve the bridge of his flagship on the monitor. "We hid it to save you. We spent a century trying to forget how to do this." The Krell hegemony fell in the span of 6 hours, not because Earth wanted their territory, but because the human military had moved with the mechanical indifference of a surgeon removing a tumor. When the relativistic slugs stopped firing and the swarms were recalled to their magnetic canisters, the Onyx Reach was empty. No wreckage remained, only a fine, glittering dust that caught the light of the distant stars. In the aftermath, the great spire of a Telgard was no longer a place of mockery. When Ilara returned to the high chamber, the other species of the hegemony did not click or hiss. They moved back, clearing a path wide enough for a fleet. They looked at her small, soft hands and saw the invisible blood of an empire. Ironically, the peace that followed was the most stable the galaxy had ever known. But it wasn't the peace of the diplomat, it was the quiet of the graveyard. Humanity had rescinded its treaties, but they didn't take the throne. Instead, they took the watch. When the first signals of the extragalactic Shroud Eaters began to leak from the void beyond the rim, a threat that had terrified the hegemony for eons, the humans didn't flee. They didn't even flinch. They simply turned their sensors toward the dark, their fingers hovering over the rails of the ghost slugs. They had shown the galaxy their teeth, and now they would use them to protect the very people who had once called them prey. The lesson was etched into the history of every star-faring race from that day forward. Never mistake a choice for a limitation. As Ilara stood on the observation deck of the Othelgard Spire, watching the first joint defense fleet assemble under human command, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was a fellow diplomat, trembling slightly. "How do you live with it?" the alien asked. "Knowing what you are capable of." Ilara looked out at the stars, her expression unreadable. "We don't live with it," she replied. "We live in spite of it, and we pray we never have to be that version of ourselves again."